Hello, welcome. So in today's session, we'll learn about JWT, which is JSON Web Token. And I'll start with the presentation, and then we will go ahead and learn about JWT and all the aspects of JSON Web Token. So let's get started. So let's start with the slide. So in today's presentation, we'll be going through what is a JSON Web Token and when should we use it. And also we'll look through the difference between the JWT and the session ID. And also we'll look through different structure of our JWT. And also we will learn about the JWT signature. Okay. So let's understand what is a JWT. JWT is an open standard that defines a compact and a self-contained way to securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object. So a JWT is a signed JSON object with a specific structure. And why do we need JSON Web Token or JWT? Let's say we want our certain endpoints to be only accessible to the logged in user. All we do is require a JWT, and then we can check the JWT. JWT is a proof that the client logged in successfully at some point in the past, right? So this is what JWT is. And when you can see, it's an open standard that defines a compact and self-contained way to securely transmit information between parties as a JSON, right? And JSON Web Token will consist of the header. This part is called the payload, and the third part is called a signature. We'll learn about this. And why should we use JSON Web Token or JWT? So we should use JWT mainly for authorization, and very rarely we use as an information exchange, but we can use for authorization as well as information exchange. Okay. And here let's learn about our JWT and our session ID. Okay. So if you see this part of the graph, you can see that we have a session. We have a client, we have a web server, and we have some memory, and we're assuming that the memory is a Redis cache. And if you can see, when a client logs in, it passes a username and the password. And now in the web server, it will authenticate the user and will generate a session ID. And now the generated session ID will be stored in the memory, and the session ID will be sent back to the client. And now the client will store the session ID as a cookie. And on subsequent request, the client will send the session ID with the request. And in the server, in the web server, what we'll do is we will check the session ID in the memory, and then we'll process the request. If the session ID is okay, then in that case, we will send back the response. Okay. So if you see the JWT part, if you can see here, we have a client and we have a web server, but so there is no memory storage or a local memory or a Redis memory. So this part of the memory can be a local memory or a Redis memory. Okay. So let's say if the user logged into the client, it will pass the username and password, and then we'll authenticate the username, and based on that authentication, we will then generate a JSON Web Token, and then we will send back the JSON Web Token to the client. So the client will store the JSON Web Token in the cookie, and on the subsequent request, the client will send this JSON Web Token. And in the web server, what we can do is we can check and verify our JSON Web Token. And if we successfully verified, then in that case, we can process the request and send a response. So if you can see in these two differences, here we have an external factor, which is a memory. For every user, we need to store the session in the either local memory or a session memory, right? Or in a Redis cache. But here, when you use JWT, you can see that we don't have any extra layer of storing the JSON Web Token, because the JSON Web Token is stored by the client, not by the web server. Okay. So let's go to the next. So let's try to understand a monolithic application. So let's say we have a web server, and when we use session based, so when a user from this machine try to log in, he'll send the login and password, he'll go to the web server, and the web server will generate the session ID, it will store in the web server, and it will send back the session ID. So now you can see that the session ID is stored in multiple places, right? So on the subsequent request, we will need to go and verify if this session is that particular user. Okay. But in case of JSON Web Token, we will log in, and once the login is successful, we will generate the JSON Web Token and send back to the client. So now the JSON Web Token is just stored to the client and not to the server. So there is no extra layer of computation to be needed in this single server web apps. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. We have a multiple server session based here. We have a load balancer here, and then we have a Redis cache here. Okay. So you can see sessions will be stored in the memory. By memory, we mean the internal memory of this web server. And then we'll have to store the session ID as well in the Redis cache and also in the cookie. So you can see we have stored the same session ID as a cookie in the cache and in the memory. Okay. So now let's say a user logged in here. It goes here and it logs in, right? And now we store this session ID here as that user, and then we send back the session ID. So in the subsequent request, this client will send the session ID to the load balancer. Now we need to do a computation here. So where to send this traffic? So we need to go and check the cache, right? And now if the session ID exists, we need to send to the web server. And also we need to check if the session ID really belong to that particular user, because we need to check if the user is admin or certain roles, right? We need to process the user based on his certain roles. So session lookup is more complicated, right? We need to check here, we need to check here, and we need to check also here. Okay. And also, let's say in case of a system failure, let's say this web server from the left side crashes for some reason. When a user was logged in, this particular user's session was stored here, right? So in this case, session recovery is impossible. So we cannot really recover the session, or the user have to log in again, right? So there's a problem. So let's go to our JWT based. So now this is pretty simple. Since the token is stored in the client, we'll just have to go and verify the token. If the token is successfully verified, then based on the payload of the token, we can process our further request. So this is much more simpler if we compare these two. So you can see the application with JWT is much more simpler. Okay. And also tokens are stored with the client, and it is faster authorization, and it is based on a token validation. So if the token is valid, then the user is authorized. Otherwise, we deny the user. And the infrastructure between these two setups is completely different, and this is much more simpler than the other one, right? So now let's try to understand the difference between session ID and the JSON Web Token. So we can see in the aspect of data storage, in terms of JWT, data are stored on the client, but in session ID, data are saved in the server as well as in the client, right? And in case of data encryption, JWT are encrypted and signed by the server, and session ID is just encrypted and signed, okay? And in case of token content, in case of JWT, we can save or have few user information or all user information, but in the session ID, it just serves as a reference to the user. So when you have a session ID, that really represents the user ID of some user, right? So it's just a reference to the particular user. And in case of server interaction, we don't have to do a server lookup for the token, but in case of session ID, we need to have a server lookup for the user information and check. So in this case, we get the user information from the token, but in this case, we have to go and find the user based on the session ID. So this is much more heavier, and it requires a server lookup. Okay, so let's understand the JSON Web Token structure. So JSON Web Token consists of three parts separated by dots. You can see here. So it's separated by dot and dot. So what are these three parts? So it's basically a header, payload, and a signature. You can see we have a header, we have payload, and signature. So the first part, which I've highlighted in this red color, this is a header. And the second part, which is highlighted in this pink color or purple color, this is a payload. And the section highlighted by this blue color is called the signature. So let's go into them one by one. So let us understand about this header. So the header typically consists of two parts. You can see here we have this ALG and we have this TYP. So you can see by this ALG we mean the algorithm, and by TYP we mean the type of the token, which is basically JWT. By ALG we mean the signing algorithm. Okay, so when we sign this particular token, which algorithm do we use? So it can be HMAC, it can be SHA-256, or it can be RSA. Okay, so it should be here the header. So the header is then base64 URL encoded to form the first part of the JSON Web Token, as you can see here. So this part is base64 URL encoded. And let's go to our payloads. Basically, there are three types of claims. So we have a registered claim, we have public claims, and we have private claims. So any sensitive informations are used in these private claims, and anything related to our public, like let's say about the user ID, about the user roles, like if the user is admin, or about the information of the name. So any information that is not sensitive or non-sensitive informations are stored as a public claim. And in case of this registered claim, so there can be such claims which cannot be a private and a public. So in that case, we use this registered claim. Okay. And then this payload, this JSON payload is then base64 URL encoded to form the second part of the JSON Web Token. So you can see, so this is basically a encoded format of our payload in base64 URL encoded. Okay. So now let's understand about the signature. In order to create a signature, we need the base64 URL encoded of the header, and then we need the base64 URL encoded of the payload, and also we need the secret. So in this case, this is a secret, and here you can choose either we want to make that the signature be a base64 encoded or not. Okay. So when we learn about the signature, it's the encoded header, the encoded payload, a secret, the algorithm specified in the header. So we need all this. And how is this JWT signed? Okay. So JWT is signed by using a secret with the HMAC algorithm, or by a public private key pair using RSA or ECDA. Okay. So let's go through this JWT in our browser. So I've opened jwt.io. So we have a playground here. So as you can see, It says that JSON Web Tokens are an open industry standard RFC 7519 method for representing claims securely between two parties. Okay, so here JWT.io allows us to decode, verify, and generate a JWT. Okay, so you can see here we can create a JSON Web Token based on these multiple algorithms. So we have HS256, we have RS256, and so on. And you can see we have this particular token here. So what does this particular token contains? So basically this part is a header. So it says that the algorithm is HS256 and it is of type JWT. So let's try to change the algorithm. So now you can see we have the algorithm here and the token is changed now. Okay. And let's go ahead see what the payload part really contains. Okay, so you can see here we have this sub. Basically this means that whom the token refers to. Sub basically means a subject. And then we have this field name, learn with Pratap, and we have this channel, and this is the name of my channel, YouTube channel. And you can see we have this IAT. This basically means that issued at. So when was this token issued? So this key will give us the information. Okay, and also we have this verify signature. In order to create a signature, what we need here is we need the base URL encoded of the header, base URL encoded of the payload, and also the secret. Okay, so this way we can create a JSON Web Token. And if you want to learn more about JSON Web Token, I have created a blog, and you can go to pratapsharma.io/whatisjwt, and you can find the information about JSON Web Token in a written form, and you can go to our JSON Web Tokens. So this is exactly the written format of our presentation, and you can go through them one by one. So I hope I was able to help you with understanding our JSON Web Token, and thank you for watching. And if you like this video, please drop a like and also drop a comment. Thank you.